Greetings, quality people. I'm Jeff Vieira.
And I'm Norm Howe, and this is the Fearless Workplace.
We've got a very special Veterans Day episode for you that you're not going to want to miss. And I'd like to introduce our first veteran, none other than our very own Norm Howe. Norm, tell us the story of your service and what it means to you.
Well, Jeff, it turns out that, and who knew this? I didn't know it because I just found out a friend of mine, is a general in the Women's Army Corps, and she said, well, Norm, based on what you've told me about your service, you are actually a veteran, and we're going to have a ceremony to honor the veterans. And I said, no, I can't be a vet. I never, went. And she said, oh, no, you are a veteran of the Vietnam era. Oh, really? Yeah, because I was not in the regular army. I was in the reserves. And I didn't want to have anything to do with going over to Vietnam. And I was trying to avoid it every step along the way, keeping up with my college progression and stuff like that, one step ahead of the draft. And finally, I I was talking to my parents about. I was almost afraid to talk to my dad about it because I don't know if I told you this, Jeff, but my father was career Army. He was uh, for almost 30 years. And he was a veteran, and I was a little bit concerned about expressing any reluctance to go serve my country. But finally, one day he comes up to me and he says, "I got you a place in a reserve unit." And so that was kind of strange. Well, anyway, I go into the reserves, and here I am in the 309th Veterinary Corps, and the fighting 309th, and
I believe the motto is they also serve who only deworm and neuter.
yeah, and but it turns out it was kind of weird because it turns out the veterinary corps is the Army's version of the FDA. Who knew that? So we were actually what they call food inspectors, and they trained us to do that. Okay, and I would do things like our summer camp. With at least one year involved us going out to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, and they gave me a jeep, and I had it. They had the 82nd Airborne was in maneuvers at Camp McCoy, and when they would do an airdrop, everybody jumped, including the mess sergeant. And probably better than anybody, mess sergeants are born angry. All right. And let me just say that an airborne mess sergeant knows how to be angry. And I had to go out there and tell them that their little milk cartons were past the expire date. That was not fun. Anyway, so anyway, I managed to get through my 6 years of service, uh, and am living my life. And here, 30, 20 years later, I'm told technically I'm a veteran because I was serving during the Vietnam era. So here I am. I'm a veteran. Pay homage
Well,
to
thank
me.
you. That's right. Thank you for your service, Norm. But it's true. We have it's interesting because during the Vietnam era, with the draft on, and especially once it surged in the late '60s, right under LBJ, um, you had it was hard to get into the reserves, right? There was a lot of people trying to get into the reserves, because if they pulled your draft number, there was a good chance that you were going to go straight infantry and go right over and pick up a rifle and go on patrol in the jungle. Um, but we have reserve, we have National Guard. There was a lot of folks, there have always been, that have served in those roles. They are full members of the Department of Defense. They're considered veterans. It may interest you to note too that there are different components in the military that, depending on whether we're at war or not, likewise are considered to be veterans. So when you talk about the Coast Guard, which is ordinarily under the Department of Transportation for their day-to-day kind of things, in wartime, the Coast Guard becomes a very important part of our coastal defenses, and and obviously the Coast Guard itself is run as a military organization all the time, not just in wartime. So they become kind of full members, if you will, of DoD. Same thing with Merchant Marine. We know from World War II how important those naval supply lines were to get to the guys in the fighting on the front lines in Europe and in the Pacific. And it was the Merchant Marine sailors who really kept that lifeline going, and were often the target of German U-boats as well as Japanese destroyers. Um, so they saw more than their fair share of combat uh, during wartime as a result. So yeah, we and death, absolutely. So, and I'm sure you know, Normie, you know, whether reserves or not, it's no picnic. You have to have the training. You're in uniform. You're subject to military discipline, and there is always the chance, as a member of the reserve, that you will be called up into a combat role. Moreover, a lot of active duty military veterans who leave the force actually go into a component called the Ready Reserve. Now, the Ready Reserve doesn't do anything military typically, but what it means is, hey, we've got your record on file, and if we need you, we're going to call you back to active duty, right? So we joke about it a little bit, Norm, but the fact of the matter is your service during that era of wartime is service, just like any other military service. So you are a veteran in good standing in my eyes, and I'm sure the eyes of many of our listeners. And we do thank you for your service. It was interesting. I served in the active duty Air Force, so I was a graduate of the Air Force Academy. Um, I was not one of the valedictorian had nothing to worry about from me. I was one of the guys that we were sitting there in graduation. You know, you're sitting there in the middle of Falcon Stadium, and we're all in our parade dress, and I had a buddy of mine looked over at me, he was sitting a few rows down, and he looked at me and he goes, "We did it. We fooled him. We fooled him." I said, "Shut up. It's not over yet." They can still get us. Just but we got to throw our hats in the air that day. And for a school that's kind of well renowned for producing engineers, you would think that when you take these big heavy parade caps and you launch them in the air as the F-16s fly over, you would think that engineers would know better than to keep staring up. And we had guys with broken noses because the cap came and hit them right in the face. It was something else. You would think that at a minimum they would have taught us the what goes up comes down
in the Air
at the
Force
top aeronautical
Academy.
institution. Yeah, but there's a certain amount of cadet obtuseness that factors in. So when I went in, it was funny. So in your senior year, midway through your senior year, second semester, the Air Force Personnel Center finally figures out what the hell they're going to do with you, right? And so it's based on order of merit, and you submit your dream sheet, we call it, right? Which is you put in, hey, here's what I want to do, and here's where I want to do it. So for the guys that are going to be pilots, right, they'll put in, this is, I want to go to pilot training, and these are my bases in order of preference. And if you happen to be a genius and you're up there in the order of merit, you might actually get it. But for those of us who are down the ranks a little bit and just holding on by our fingertips, the experience is a little different. We have to factor in the fact that the popular jobs are probably not going to be for us. So our dream sheet is kind of like, what do I give on? Do I go with a popular job in an unpopular location, or do I go with a popular location in an unpopular job? So I chose the latter when I went in, and it was funny. I unfortunately did not fully estimate how difficult it was to get those jobs. They cut a bunch of the pilot slots for us, and there was a drawdown when I was graduating. And so a lot of the pilots now that couldn't get into pilot training, they were going to have to go into some of these jobs. So what jobs did they want to do? Well, the ones that are close to the aircraft, right? So if you can't fly the aircraft, well, maybe you go into maintenance. So you can at least be adjacent, right? You be on the flight line, you can learn something while you're waiting for your pilot training slot to open up. Or you go into things like intelligence, right? So obviously, a lot of the missions are based on the intel that we get. That could be a good thing on there. So those kind of gigs were snapped up by the guys who didn't get the pilot training, right? And so that left some historically underserved jobs by academy graduates. And so I knew I had actually gotten one of these when our major called us in, and I went into his office. I'm sorry, he was a captain at the time, and he says, first thing he says to me is, "You know, there are no bad jobs in the Air
Oh
Force."
no.
When someone says that to you, you are getting one of the bad jobs in the Air Force. Right? So he told me I was going to be a supply officer. So I was like, oh, that's wonderful, right? So visions of passing out toilet paper, to fighter pilots, just danced in my head, right? But they leavened it by saying, and you're going to do it in Panama City, Florida. Well, I was 22 years old. Okay, all right, I can do this. I walked out of the office pretty happy, right? It turned out to be a great thing. Little did I know that supply and fuels management and logistics was going to be a super interesting place to be. Mid 90s was a great time to be in it because, of course, when I got out of the Air Force, uh, there was a lot of interest because we were just beginning the outsourcing stuff. So, logistics people, supply chain people, it was a very good skill to have, right? And on top of that, I was still close to the flight line. I got to hear the planes buzz overhead all the time. And it really was a great bunch of people to work with. The other nice thing about logistics is there's a lot of people, so you have a chance to lead large teams. And it really worked out super well. So whenever anyone asks me, well, what did you do in the Air Force? What did you fly? Which is always the question, right? My answer is an LSD 114, which is a large steel disc, is exactly what I flew. But Patton said, "Hey, at least you won't have to say, when they ask you what did you do in the war, Daddy, I was shoveling crap in Louisiana." It was a little bit better gig than that. But I still feel the same way when people say, when people very kindly say, "Thank you for your service." It's like, well, I'm not sure that my service set any records, but I'm glad I did it, and I certainly took a lot away from it. Tremendous people, and I was actually out of the Air Force before 9/11 2001 hit, and then things really got real. But I want to talk to you today, Norm, about somebody who was an academy graduate who was in the thick of it during the era that you were just talking about, the Vietnam era. And in fact, at the academy, there is a dormitory that I spent my cadet career in that is named after this person, Captain Lance Peter Saijan. I'm going to read a little bit and from his Medal of Honor citation to just tell you what kind of a guy this was. And I will tell you flat out, my service is in no way comparable to his service. And he was just 25 years old when he completed it. So while on a flight over North Vietnam, Captain Saijan ejected from his disabled aircraft. Now, his disabled aircraft, he was flying F-4Cs. So F-4Cs, Phantom jets, right? Fast jets that they had pulled back in from the Navy and, could take a beating. And what he was doing was he was bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And he was bombing it in Laos, right? So at the time, we had problems because Laos and Cambodia were supposedly neutral in the war. In fact, they were allied with North Vietnam, And whenever we would bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail in North Vietnam, as it ran to South Vietnam, uh, what would happen is they would shift the supplies to a trail run, parallel trails in Laos and in Cambodia. At this time, which was late 1967, there was a lot of supplies coming down that trail because, unbeknownst to us at the time, they were getting ready to launch the Khe Sanh offensive. So, big offensive coming, lots of men and material moving down that trail. So, Captain Saigon is out there flying above it and trying to interdict those supplies, keep them from getting where they need to go. Well, what happened was they went to drop their bombs. They had 6 bombs on this thing, and they dropped their bombs onto the trail. And originally, they thought that the plane was shot down. Now, the best evidence is that, in fact, what happened was the fuses didn't work right. And one of the bombs actually set off just 50 feet from the plane. So, if you can imagine this big explosion just 50 feet away from an aircraft traveling that fast, there's no time to react hardly. Lance's crew member on that flight didn't make it out. He, by some miracle, made it out, was able to eject. Okay. So he ejected from his disabled aircraft. He lands on a mountainside. Okay. And not very far from the trail itself. So there's a lot of traffic around when he lands. He manages to successfully evade capture for 6 weeks. They say during this time, he was seriously injured, suffered from shock and extreme weight loss due to lack of food. Okay. How was he injured? Well, when they say injuries, we're not talking like he was banged up, right? Which happened to a lot of guys, especially when you drop onto a mountainside through a bunch of trees. He had a compound fracture of his leg, so the bone's sticking through his leg. He had a skull fracture. He had a concussion. And his right hand, his dominant hand, was mangled. He had 3 of his fingers broken, and they were bent fully back. So can't do anything with that hand, right? So this is the condition that he was in when he hit that mountain. And so for the next 6 weeks, instead of, he had his pistol on him, he could have fired his pistol off and gotten, even the enemy to come give him some medical attention or something. He didn't. He resisted capture. And he was delirious for most of this time. So he, was in and out of consciousness, still managed to hide. He lived on moss, lived on insects, lived on dew, and occasionally on water from a stream. And that's all he had. This guy was 6'2", huge for a fighter pilot, right? By the time they took him to the camp, he weighed 100 pounds at 6'2". Okay. So they say here, after being captured by North Vietnamese soldiers, he was taken to a holding point for subsequent transfer to a prisoner of war camp. So a very common thing that they would do. If they found somebody out on patrol, they would take them prisoner and bring them back to the nearest holding area, right? In his emaciated and crippled condition, he managed to call one of the guards over to him. He knocked him unconscious with a karate chop to the back of the skull from his left hand, right? So he overpowered one of the guards and crawled into the jungle. He managed to be in the jungle evading capture for another, half day or so. Okay. And then finally, he was unconscious and they found him and dragged him back in. So then he got pulled in and taken to the Hanoi Hilton, right? He was kept in solitary confinement and he was interrogated at length. During the interrogation, he was severely tortured. So, while he was evading everything, he managed to injure his arm pretty badly. And so his interrogator would twist his arm during the interrogation, which was excruciating for him. And the thing was, fortunately for us, there were a couple of other POWs who were in the Hilton at that time, 10 feet away from him. And so they could hear everything that went on in that interrogation. That's how we know what happened. So during the interrogation, he was severely tortured. However, he did not divulge any information to his captors. He gave him his name, rank, serial number, and he cussed them out. He just kept telling them, when I get better, you're going to get it. Right? And now, mind you, at this time, he is in a leg cast from his thigh to his ankle. They didn't put the leg cast on to treat his injury to help him out medically, by the way. They did it because after he first tried to escape, they put it on so it would immobilize him, so he wouldn't be able to evade as well. Okay, so he's in there being tortured in this leg cast, sores all over him, emaciated, and he's still given the North Vietnamese hell. He was also, during his lucid periods back in the cell with the other prisoners, he was constantly plotting to escape again. He was actually doing exercises on his injured arm so that he could strengthen it enough to take part in another escape. Okay. They said he never complained about his physical condition, the treatment, anything. His focus was, how do I get, out of here? He eventually lapsed into delirium. He actually contracted pneumonia. They kept him in a concrete cell that had standing water on the floor, so ideal conditions to develop pneumonia. And he was placed in the care of another prisoner. During his intermittent periods of consciousness until his death, he never complained of his physical condition. On several occasions, spoke of future escape attempts. Captain Saijon's extraordinary heroism and intrepidity, above and beyond the call of duty at the cost of his life, are in keeping with the highest traditions of the U.S. Air Force and reflect great credit upon himself and U.S. Armed Forces. So he died in that prison, right? But the example that he set, this was 55 years ago, this happened, right? And yet the example that he set is still carried down to this day. Every cadet that comes to the academy knows who Lance Saijon is. They know who he did. And the vast majority of us have read the book that Malcolm McDonald did on it called Into the Mouth of the Cat, which tells his full story. So he's a tremendous hero. He was the first Academy graduate to win the Medal of Honor. So a very important figure in the history of the institution. And they said of him that this is the kind of guy that the military is constantly trying to produce, but very rarely does, right? You talk about someone who, he was an athlete, he was a football player, became a fighter pilot. So someone who's got a pretty indomitable will, right? And someone who, when we went through the academy, we had to attend survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training, right? We all did it our sophomore year. And we went through scenarios that were based kind of on his experience. Was, hey, our plane has been shot down. Now we need to learn how to evade the bad guys. If we are captured, we need to learn how to conduct ourselves in captivity so that we maintain our honor and so that we protect our country. And it's a rite of passage that every single one of us had to go through. And it's no joke. I mean, by the time you're done with this, I wasn't 100 pounds, but I lost 40 pounds during the several weeks of the program.
Oh boy.
We used to talk about it like it was like a camping trip if your parents were really negligent. So it was the training was as realistic as they could possibly make it, based on the experience of especially our Vietnam era pilots like Lance Saijon. And all of us during that time, his story gave us what we needed in order to endure and get through the training. There have been a number of folks that have been shot down in combat since, and you'll hear no small number of them say that it was Saijon's will that really inspired them. So this guy is a hero who has continued his incredible will to, and sense of honor has continued to inspire so many people in the armed forces down to this very day. And he's very well remembered. He grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, so he's still a hometown hero there in Milwaukee. Here long after his death. So I can only hope that the U.S. military continues to produce men of the caliber of Captain Lance Sijon, because as long as we do, this country's going to be safe.
That's such an example, I would say, to any organization, or what the Air Force is doing there, because any organization that wants to develop a people that are motivated to help the organization be successful needs to have stories like that. They need to have heroes and say, here, this is an example of what we're talking about here. Nobody can really achieve this, but this is the ideal here.
Yeah, and there's the example. You would have thought, Norm, that nobody could achieve that. How do you possibly? I mean, here was a guy that no one would think had tapped out because he was so badly injured. I mean, he's unconscious, and yet he's still fighting. He's still a combatant. He's a very dangerous man. They literally put the cast on his leg because he was so dangerous. I mean, if this guy can take out a guard, in his condition, it's like he must have appeared to be a Superman to them, right? But we all have that in us. That's what we're trying to channel, and it's just such an inspiration when you see what people can actually do when it's we've talked a lot about fear this year on Norm. Can you imagine being in a jet? So first off, you're flying a mission. You're in a place that you're not really supposed to be in. So you have to wonder, if you do get shot down, is anyone going to come help you or not? Right? All of a sudden, you drop your bombs, just like you're trained to do, and then bam, you're out in the air. Your parachute's deploying from your ejection seat. You're hurt, and and you're landing in enemy territory. The enemy is all around you, and you're on the ground badly hurt. He lost his survival kit at one point, so he didn't even have the little small comforts that come with that. And and then you're in the hands of an enemy that is going to torture you for information, perhaps unto death.
Yeah, all you
And
have
yet
is
this
your instincts.
guy, yeah, and yet this guy, he's 25 years old and apparently utterly fearless. Utterly. He had to be afraid. And yet somehow, deep within him, he managed to, conquer that fear and set an example for all of us that lives to this day.
Yeah, it's amazing when you confront something like that, when you hear something like that. It's my of course I never had any experience like that. I grew up, as I said, my dad was career Army, so we were moving from place to place frequently. And I knew that my dad had been in World War II, and he had been, as far as I knew, he was in an anti-aircraft unit around an air base in New Guinea. And I had always thought, well, of course, being in a war is always going to be tough. But if you're going to be in a war, being in an anti-aircraft unit around an air base is not the worst place to be, you know. And of course, when I was growing up, everybody's dad had been in the war, and so I just really didn't pay much attention to it. And stupid me, I didn't pay any attention to the screaming at night that would happen periodically, and I just didn't connect that with the war at all. And I'm sure today we would call that PTSD, but it never. And So it wasn't until not too many years before my dad died that I heard from my cousin Ann. She and I were talking one time, and she says, "Well, you know, your dad was in amphibious landings during the war, and he was fighting the Japanese with bayonets." And I said, "Wait a minute, no, he was in an anti-aircraft unit." And she said, "Well, that's what that's what we heard." And so the next time I went out to visit my dad, we were kind of alone for a while, and I said, "Dad, uh, cousin Ann tells me that you were doing amphibious landings during the war." I said, "Is that true?" "Yep." "Well, I thought you were in an anti-aircraft unit." He says, "You did what they told you to do." And he says, and I said, "Really? And you were fighting the Japanese with bayonets?" "Yep." "Well, and I thought, so I said, finally, we were starting to get along pretty well together. And I said, "So, Dad, we both know you're not a hero." "Yep." "So, what would ever make you climb down off a big steel ship down a rope ladder into a rubber dinghy and go charging against the Japanese with machine guns?" And he says, "Well, you've never been on a troop ship before, have you?" I said, "Well, clearly not." He says, "Worst experience I've ever had in my life." "Well, what do you mean by that, Dad?" He says, "Well, you're all packed in there like sardines. You got 1 foot of bunk space going up 12-foot high in the hold where you are, and the bottom of that ship is awash with every kind of fluid that can come out of a human being, ankle deep, and everybody was sick from the minute we launched." He says, "I wanted off of that ship so bad. If they would have strapped me to a torpedo and shot me on shore, I would have gone." So not everybody has this dramatic experience of getting launched out of a fighter jet like Sejan did. A lot of times it's just surviving, in the logistics of getting the human beings from one place to another. And the fact that they did that, he didn't get any medals or anything like that. Nobody wrote it up in the papers, no nothing. He just survived. And here I am.
That's it. Well, it's funny because the real heroism sometimes isn't in the great dramatic rare acts of it, right? And a lot of the fear while you're in the military is, hey, if push really comes to shove, will I be able to do what I need to do? And you worry about it, right? Maybe I'll freeze up. Maybe I'll do something stupid. Maybe uh, and you can't. The thing of it is no matter how good your training is, you can't know until you're in that moment, right? And and the thing that people don't realize, unless they've actually been in the military, is just how much excruciating boredom it is most of the time, right? Sitting around waiting for things to happen. They'll march you around and do busy work and training for the sake of just keeping you you know, from getting into trouble and that sort of thing. Because it's just, it, I think Churchill said that war was, uh, just long, extreme periods of total boredom, punctuated by moments of extreme terror.
Right, right.
Right?
And he was actually in
And
it. Not that many people know that he
oh,
was.
he went off. He actually took part in the last charge of the British cavalry, which which occurred during the River War in Sudan at Omdurman. So and so he actually he was kind of a disappointment to his parents in terms of his military career. He didn't do well enough in school to get into Sandhurst, as an infantry officer. So they had to settle for a cavalry post for him. And the bad thing about a cavalry post was that meant he had to pay for the horse, which was quite an expense, right? So his family wasn't real thrilled to have, the cavalry officer, Winston Churchill, in there. So he started out doing that. His military career actually in the first phase didn't last that long. And then he went to cover the Boer War in South Africa in 1900 as a correspondent, a war correspondent. So he thought he would, get close to the war by writing. Well, Churchill being Churchill, there was a moment when the train that they were riding on was waylaid by Boer attackers, and he picked up a gun and just started fighting the Boer. So he got captured. He was a POW. On the first day he was captured, he notified the commandant that, because he was a VIP, prisoner for them, because his father was actually leading the party in the House of Representatives, the House of Commons, right? So his father was expected, to be a prime minister of Britain at some point, right? And so this was a big get for the Boer, and Churchill informed the commandant of the camp that it was going to be his duty to escape. And so, he wasn't much. I think he was actually younger than Saigon was at the time, and so the commandant of the camp was like, this upper class twit of a of a war correspondent is telling me he's going to escape from my camp. But he did. He got it. It was funny. He ticked off the people that he was supposed to be escaping with. So when they went to escape, only he escaped. They were supposed to come over the wall with him, and they were like, "No, we'll stay here." So he escaped. He was like, "Fine." He went on his own. He went trekking across the veldt there, and he found a farmhouse. And he's like, "I got to take a chance. This is the only thing around here for miles." It turned out to be the only farmer who was, kind of loyal to the British Crown for miles around. So he was lucky. They hit him in a coal bin and then managed to get him on another train out so that he could get back to, behind friendly lines. And so Churchill being Churchill, he became the toast of London for escaping from the Boer, and and parlayed that into his first seat in the House of Commons, right? Well, many years later, so he had risen like a rocket through the political ranks. He was the youngest First Lord of the Admiralty that the British had right when World War I kicked off. And it was actually Churchill's idea to try and break the stalemate in Europe by the Turks were the allies of the Austrians and the Germans in Europe in that war, and so Churchill hatched a plan to use the British Navy to storm the Dardanelles, and basically strategically envelop the Turks, knock them out of the war. So that would have opened up a completely new front that the Germans hadn't built extensive trench works in, and it could have ended the war. The problem was the Turks had done a pretty good job setting up defenses in there, and it made the captains of those ships frightened to kind of go through that passage. And so it led to the Battle of Gallipoli, where they successfully managed to get through. And then the Anzacs, the Australians, the New Zealanders, they landed on the beach, but then they couldn't get them any of the support that they needed. So literally, these poor guys are stuck with the entire Turkish army, and they're on a narrow strip of beach, and they don't have enough ammo and heavy weaponry to get out. So eventually, they had to be withdrawn, and in the ensuing scandal, Churchill lost his job as First Lord of the Admiralty, but he didn't just go, write books. He actually went to serve in the trenches as a lieutenant colonel. So he went and fought in the trench war in World War One. He wasn't a rear echelon guy in the chateau drinking champagne like some of them were. He was right there in the trenches with the troops, going over the top and everything else. So he was a true veteran. He saw combat. He fought nobly in it, and but yet another guy that many people, to your point, Norm, don't realize had some pretty heroic service of his own.
That's amazing. And I know that they were running up against the Turks, who were equipped with German machine guns, which which the
That's right,
British
the Mausers. Yep.
did not have. The British and the Australians and the New Zealanders.
Yeah, and people don't realize too that the Turks are some pretty fierce fighters,
Oh yeah,
right? So these guys were. This was during the time when Kemal Ataturk was a major military leader there, and the Turks were well known for their fierceness. They did not retreat. They didn't surrender. They fought fiercely. And as a matter of fact, when we got to the Korean War, the Turks were one of our fiercest allies uh, in that conflict. So
yeah.
they were well known. They didn't have the best equipment. They didn't have the best training. And if you've seen some Turks, they're not generally big, heavily muscled people. But my God, could they fight?
And they were fierce. Yeah,
So Norm, as a way of wrapping it, I mean, I think the takeaways from today are uh, every veteran has a story, and every veteran's service adds to the legacy of honor of this country and the countries in which they serve.
that is for sure. And if they don't talk about it, that probably means it's deeper than you think.
Amen. Amen. So thank you for your service. Thank you for your father's service. And may we continue to produce such men and women this country to do the same. Uh, for everyone out there, we also have a little bit of a bittersweet announcement to make this week. Our service as your podcast host is coming to an end. So this will be the last episode of the Fearless Workplace. Fortunately, we think that the body of work that we have out there is really solid, really interesting, and that that being able to refer to that in the future will be helpful to you. And Norm and I have plans coming up to kind of continue what we've learned about how to identify and how to mitigate the fear that we see in our workplace today. So please stay tuned for that. Norm, do you have any last words for our audience?
Well, just that this has been an amazing experience for me. Jeff told me when we started the Team and Workplace Excellence Forum that we were going to do a podcast. And my first response was, "What do you mean we?" And because I had no idea. But hey, it's worked. And it's really been a great experience. Really enjoyed it.
Terrific. Well, thanks, Norm. And it's been great working with you on this. Thank you so much for your insightful questions, for the terrific stories. And like I say, I will treasure the work that we've done together here, uh, for as long as I'm still this side of the soil.
All right.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Happy Veterans Day. And please, uh, reach out to the veterans in your life and just let them know that you appreciate what they've done for all of us.